This is a strigil. Hold it in your hand. It's heavier than you'd expect. About 10 ounces of bronze, slightly warm from your palm. The blade curves like a shallow spoon, worn smooth along the inner edge from decades of use. If you ran your thumb along that edge, you'd feel it. Not sharp enough to draw blood, but firm enough to scrape. Romans used these in the baths, not to wash, to physically remove the layer of olive oil, sweat, dust, and dead skin from their bodies. Sound would have been distinct, a rhythmic scraping, metal on wet skin, echoing off marble walls. We think of Roman baths as monuments to civilization, gleaming marble, sophisticated plumbing, social sophistication. But what if their hygiene practices were less effective than we've imagined, and far more uncomfortable? This is an examination of the Strigil, and what it reveals about Roman cleanliness may surprise you. Quick note: this content is educational only, based on archaeological evidence and ancient sources. The Strigil appears first in Greek gymnasia, around the 6th century before the Common Era. Athletes would coat their bodies in olive oil before exercise. The oil mixed with sweat and dust from the wrestling ground. After training, they scraped it off with curved bronze blades. Romans adopted this practice during the Republic, after sustained contact with Greek colonies in southern Italy. By the 1st century of the Common Era, every public bath in the empire likely had stacks of communal strigils. Wealthy Romans carried personal ones, sometimes made of silver. Most people used bronze. Let us examine how this actually worked. Before bathing, you would coat your body in olive oil. Sometimes the oil was mixed with fine sand for additional abrasion. Then you entered the caldarium, the hot room. The heat induced sweating, opening your pores. The oil mixed with sweat, environmental, dust, dead skin cells, grime from a day's work. Now came the scraping. The strigil was applied in long downward strokes. Arm, then leg, then torso, then back. If you were wealthy, a slave called a capsarius performed this task. If not, you did it yourself, or traded the service with a bath companion. The blade pressed firmly against wet skin. The mixture of oil and dirt collected in the strigil's curve, then dripped onto the marble floor. The texture would have been gritty. The sound, that rhythmic metallic scraping in an echoic chamber. The smell, sharp and organic. Rancid olive oil mixed with human sweat. Consider this. The residue scraped from bathers' bodies wasn't discarded. This mixture of sweat oil, dead skin, and grime had a name. Gloios in Greek, strigimentum in Latin. It was collected and sold. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era in his Natural History, records something remarkable. Quote, "The scrapings from the bodies of athletes are looked upon as possessed of certain properties, emollient properties, calorific, resolvent. It was used in medicine, particularly for inflammations. The Roman world had a market for human body grime, but here's what matters. This method had significant problems. Olive oil dissolves sebum and surface dirt. Both are lipid soluble. That part works, but oil doesn't mix with water. So rinsing after strigil use was largely ineffective. The gloios accumulated on floors, on walls, on benches. The baths became slippery with it. The smell of rancid oil permeated these spaces, and the strigils themselves were rarely cleaned between uses. Bronze doesn't sanitize. Skin abrasions from repeated scraping, even minor ones, could introduce infections. Shared bathing in water that was infrequently changed meant disease transmission was possible, perhaps common. What's remarkable is that this method persisted for over 800 years, even as Roman engineering achieved unprecedented sophistication in other domains. aqueducts that still function today, concrete that has lasted 2 millennia. Yet for bathing, they scraped their skin with bronze blades. The question isn't whether Romans knew strigils were imperfect. It's why they continued to prefer them. Evidence suggests the answer lies in culture, not ignorance. The Stoic philosopher Seneca described the bath at Scipio's villa in his moral letters. He noted something curious. Quote, "It was not customary to bathe every day. They washed arms and legs daily, those parts soiled by work, but bathed the whole body only once a week." This was written about an earlier period of Roman history. Seneca was lamenting the decadence of daily bathing in his own time. Bathing wasn't primarily about sanitation. It was social performance, a public ritual that reinforced class structures, political alliances, social identity. The strigil was part of that performance. Wealthy men had slaves scrape them. That display of wealth and leisure mattered more than the biological reality of cleanliness. We see this in the archaeological record. Strigils have been found in graves across the empire. In Jordan, in Dacia, in Apollonia, were buried with their owners as identity markers, not because they were practically useful in the afterlife, but because they signified status, participation in a cultural practice that marked you as Roman. Let me be clear about what the evidence shows. The popular image, the one we see in films like Gladiator, shows gleaming, clean Roman baths. Marble, so white it seems to glow. Water that sparkles. Bodies emerging fresh and sanitized. The archaeological reality is different. Bath floors show gloios buildup in the grout. Drain systems became clogged with oil residue. Skeletal remains from cemeteries adjacent to bath complexes show something revealing. Evidence of skin infections at rates higher than the general population. The tepidarium and caldarium water was recycled, sometimes for days. Heating that much water required enormous amounts of fuel, wood primarily. Changing the water daily would have been economically prohibitive. So bathers entered shared pools where the water was lukewarm, clouded with oil, and teeming with whatever microorganisms the previous dozen bathers had introduced. The popular image shows Romans as champions of cleanliness, predecessors to modern public health, but the evidence suggests something more complex, a society that valued the ritual and social performance of bathing over the biological reality of sanitation. This isn't a judgment. It's an observation about human priorities. The strigil continued in use until late Antiquity, the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era. Its decline coincided with two major shifts. First, the rise of Christianity, which promoted individual bathing and viewed public nudity with suspicion. Second, the economic collapse of the Western Empire, which made olive oil increasingly scarce and expensive. By the 6th century, strigils had largely disappeared from daily life. But here's what's worth considering. We do this too. We maintain cultural practices despite knowing more effective alternatives exist. Daily shampooing, for instance, strips natural oils from hair and scalp. Dermatologists have known this for decades, yet the practice persists as a social norm, because smelling like shampoo signals cleanliness in our culture. The strigil is a reminder. Advanced civilizations don't inevitably adopt better solutions. Social meaning often outweighs practical efficiency. The Romans had the engineering brilliance to build infrastructure we still admire today. Yet for centuries, they preferred to scrape their skin with bronze blades, standing in pools of shared, oily water, because they didn't know any better. But because this is what it meant to be Roman, the strigil sits in its museum case. Now, blade worn smooth by thousands of scrapings we can no longer hear. The metal is dark now, oxidized, silent. It's tempting to see it as a primitive tool, superseded by our superior understanding of hygiene. But perhaps what it reveals is more uncomfortable. At knowing a better way doesn't always mean choosing it. That cultural identity can be more powerful and practical improvement. That we are, in many ways, still scraping ourselves with strigils of our own design, just different ones.